Hello everybody, and we are live again for episode 8, round 2 of our PBR Live Sessions. So apologies for Wednesday, there were some technical issues with our streaming server, but hopefully we are all good to go today on Friday for our PBRTV episode 8. Today we're joined again by Paul Glatzel of Powerboat Training UK. Thank you, Paul, again for joining us on your Friday evening.
Hi, Tom.
Good. So, to everybody that may have tried to tune in on Wednesday, this week we are discussing wave theory and hydrology, and how this helps us with honing our ability to be able to be a better skipper with rough water handling. Last week we chatted about going further afield, so for that we covered making sure as a skipper we were learning with a buddy, we were teaming up maybe with Facebook groups, slowly advancing our skill set and knowledge base. We then discussed our crew activity, making sure that we had crew that were comfortable with going further afield. We looked at our boat, making sure that it was seaworthy for those longer trips and that it was of the sort of right application for what we were wanting to do. We also looked at making sure you had the right kit on board, such as tools, the right navigational equipment, VHF, your clothing was correct, so that everything was packaged ready to go that further distance than maybe your local inshore boating. So with those more offshore conditions or further afield distances, you're going to have more chances of getting into some rougher weather, and we want to make sure that you're prepared and understand better. So Paul, we're breaking this into two parts. This week we're talking about wave theory. Why aren't we just jumping straight into explaining how to drive your boat through rougher conditions?
Yes, it's a good question, Tom. I think when we looked at this a few years ago, it was how could we actually give the skipper a little bit more knowledge such that the decisions they make in terms of how they drive the boat is a more educated decision. And like anything, if you've been out there in rough conditions, you'll see waves don't always look the same. They look different, they build and they break, and there are different elements of those. And if we understand the impacts of that, and perhaps how we might be able to predict the occurrence of those waves and what we're going to experience, surely that sets us up better to be able to drive. So it's really just giving us that little bit of insight as to what we're going to face out there, so we can sort of guess it.
Okay, so I guess to start things off, we'll go with our first slide, which then sort of gives us a little bit of a breakdown and intros us into the rest of what we're going to be discussing. So I'll go on to slide number 1.
Okay. So
you can talk us through what we're seeing.
Okay, so the image we're bringing up here, taken from the Wavelength Powerboat handbook, is talking about where waves come from, what generates waves. And I think ask that question we all do well, doesn't it, the weather, and undoubtedly yes, and we'll come to that in a moment. But also, flow of creates waves. We've headed it here on this image tide, but it could be tide and it could just be flow of water down a river, a stream. And if you think about that flow of water creating waves, then what factors influence what waves we're going to see? Well, the speed at which that water is flowing, its rate, that's clearly going to be a key part. The direction it's flowing in is going to be important. And what it hits as it comes along and goes wherever it's going. So imagine for a moment we've got sort of maybe a rock on the seabed here and the tide is coming along. Well, if it hits that rock, it's got to do something, it's got to kick up. So above that obstruction on the seabed, we're going to see a wave. So even zero wind, we can have waves. And we can see that as well around headlands, where quite often that headland, you get a deep bit of water, a shallow bit on the headland, and then a deeper bit. So the water comes along, hits that remnant of the headland and kicks up, creating actually standing waves above those obstructions. Now those sorts of things are predictable, and those sorts of things can catch you out as a skipper. And if you could predict, if you could look and see how do we work out what the rate of water is and when's it going to flow the fastest, then we could could predict what we're going to face. And that can make things safer. So we could go around in the morning, there's no flow, come back in the afternoon around that headland, there's loads of flow. One's going to be quite calm, one's going to be potentially rough. So that's the tight element of it, the stream elements. The other is wind. And we know waves come from wind. And there are three factors that influence that, really. How strong it is, how long is it blowing, so how long the waves have a chance to build, and over what distance the wind has blown. So if you think wind blowing across the Atlantic onto the west coast of Ireland, the waves are going to get bigger than if they're just blowing across a lake where there isn't much effect, much distance to the traveller. And understanding that feeds into that general understanding of what we're going to face out there.
Okay, so if I go on to our second slide, we can then illustrate and we can start talking about wavelength and talking about heights and just starting to learn about what we're seeing in front of us on our boat. So I'll jump onto our second slide and we can delve a little bit deeper with this. So can you talk us through this graphic here, Paul?
Yeah, so we've got a couple of images coming up which are building up some terminology, some understanding. So if you can see the image open up, you'll see crests, wave troughs, wavelength. And we can see the circles, and those circles with the low points are the energy, and the energy of the water rotating. You can see the energy diminishing as we go downwards. That distance downwards that the energy and the circulation of that water occurs is about a wave. And as that moves closer to the shore, then so that rotation hits the seabed, and that's what causes the wave to break at that stage. Now, that can happen out to sea as well. It doesn't have to be going into a beach or a shallow area. We can see that happening out to sea. You've got lots of them pushing the top part of the water along faster than the bit underneath. So it just gives a bit of background as to where some of the terminology comes from there.
Okay, cool. So if I move on to our third slide, this talks more about the high energy and again going further into seeing what's ahead of us. So can you talk a little bit about through this?
Yeah, so a lot of this terminology is taken from RNLI training and the training down in actually provide countrywide for their crew. And it was actually two things within this image. In red, we look at the energy. So on the left-hand side, we've got energy building. So the energy is building up towards a breaking wave, and we see the high energy part of that wave. And if you think the high energy, that breaking wave plunging down on the bow of our boat could be potentially hugely dangerous. To the right a little bit more, the energy's dissipated, the low energy part. So the wave has broken, lots of white aerated water. So it might be quite messy and we might get quite wet going through it, but the level of energy in that wave coming towards us is far less versus the plunger. Now, if you can see therefore the progression of the building of that wave through the shoulder, the energy building to the high energy bit to the low energy bit, we could look at that, and that's that. You know, if we go to the beach and watch waves, we'll see them do that, and we can say, well, where am I going to drive? And that's something we'll come on to at the next session. Well, is it sensible to drive at the low energy part, the high energy part, or where the energy is building? We've then got some other terminology, and you can see basically the whole idea of the plunging, the spilling of the wave, and the surging, and we can see all those things when we look at a wave on a beach. We've got a wave window, a gap between the waves, and then when we've got sort of two waves and they're coming together and closing out the gap between there. So having a look at the terminology in there, again, a way to actually reference what we're actually looking at. So if we're working with someone else, we could be talking to them as we go, but particularly here on this image, it's about understanding where the energy is. You there, Tom?
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
So that's okay. I think what we've got is a little bit of echo on your side. So when you're speaking, don't be alarmed if I've muted myself, just to cause a little bit of less feedback going on. So when people are new to boating and they're getting amongst going further afield, learning their sea condition, they're going to have situations where, for example, they've learnt this, so they can see that the energy is building in these waves, and they're starting to learn how different seas move, but they will come across a term called wind against tide. Can you explain how this affects a sea condition? I'll bring up another graph here, but it can cause some very dangerous sea conditions, can't it, very quickly?
Absolutely, and wind against tide is one of the things we learned quite early in our way courses, and it's relevant to the level 2 activity that's advanced. And it's just simply that if wind and tide are pushing in the same direction, then that tends to flatten the water, versus when wind and tide are opposed, that tends to heap up the water. And predictably enough, that sort of heaping up of the water, the creation of waves, is potentially going to make it less safe, certainly less pleasant for us. So the question is, can we predict that? And that comes down to knowing what the direction and the rate of flow of the tide is, and equally knowing what the wind is. And both of those bits of information we've covered off in previous sessions, and we can get that information. So therefore we could predict those conditions. And surely, you know, if you're going to go through an area where there's going to be rougher water due to wind against tide, if we could find that maybe 30 minutes, an hour and a half later, that it's going to be calmer, we should think about doing that.
I think that it can be, yeah, I mean, even across sort of Poole Bay, or you could go, when we're talking about going further afield, say for example you've left the Solent and you're heading down to the West Country, wind against tide can have a massive factor, can't it, on areas. And a certain thing comes to mind of Portland Bill. You want to either hug really close, or you have to go way offshore. And if you hit that wind against tide, especially as an inexperienced boater, you can get yourself into quite a situation, can't you?
Absolutely. It's well worth having a look on YouTube and having a look at Portland Bill rough weather, and there's some truly scary videos on there. But the thing is, it's predictable. If you get caught out by that, that's down to a lack of planning, because the tide is predictable, and the weather, we've got enough sources of information to be able to do that. So if we're making a coastal passage, then we can look for these sort of tidal gates where we're going to go around these headlands when the tide is flowing in the most favourable direction to us relative to the wind. So we can plan our arrival at those points to actually make our life safer and easier and more pleasant.
That leads me on really nicely to our next slide, which we're going to talk about how we learn about how wind and sea conditions change depending on obviously the topography. We talked about there, you know, going around Portland, headlands towards a beach, how it reflects off walls, etc. So if I show the next slide, would you be able to talk us through for the new boater what they should be expecting in these type of different conditions? So I'll pop the next slide up.
Absolutely. So the idea for this in terms of an image came a number of years ago when probably two experiences generated this. One was out in some quite rough conditions doing some training overseas, and we wanted to get some shelter, and I thought, let's go and hide behind that island over there, and actually what we found was that it was worse behind the island than it was in front of it. And if we look, then that's point C on the image there, and what we've actually got is the waves effectively coming round the island and meeting behind. So the waves, the friction along the coast either side of the island causes the waves to refract around the island and then interact behind, causing confused seas, because you've got wave fronts coming in two directions. If you jump to point A, then that's probably the one you see most often. If you're at the beach, well, the waves always break parallel to the beach, don't they? And the question is, why is that when the wind's coming from different directions? And that's refraction. It's as the waves come in, if the shore's here and the wave's coming in at that angle, well, this part here gets to shallower and the wave curves and then hits the beach parallel. So we could look at a chart and actually predict what we're going to see there. Point B, we see the waves reflecting. If we see water bounce off something, it reflects, doesn't it? If it hits it straight, it's going to reflect straight back. But if it hits it at an angle, then it's going to reflect back at an angle. And that can create confused, disturbed seas. And even something called klaptosis. And it's actually, again, worth going onto YouTube and actually searching klaptopic waves or klaptosis. And that's when you get the wave coming in, hitting something, coming back out. And the timing is such that you actually get a double wave and quite often a pyramid of water where it sits there just in the same place, and that can create obviously very challenging conditions. Point D on there, we've got some refraction again. Point E, we've got diffraction as the water comes through an area of narrows and spreads out. So if you did something like physics at GCSE or O-level, you might actually have seen some of these terms, and these are all just physics terms because it's all about wave technology. So as we'll come on to shortly, we could look at a chart and we could predict what we were going to see from a certain wave direction in a particular area.
So would you be able to, by looking and understanding this knowledge and starting to learn from this, as you advance in your boating knowledge, would you say, for example, Foy can have a horrific, huge seas going over the bar, etc.? And obviously, as a new boater, we're not going to recommend going into a big sea in the first place. However, you're going to be able to, as you say, be able to understand when these things are likely to happen and be able to plan accordingly that you're going at the right time for your boating. Should we bring up the chart so we can have a look at this in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, good idea.
So, okay. I've got it here.
So what we've got here is we've got an IMRE chart of the area of the Needles Channel approaching up to, on the top right hand side, Hurst Narrows at the western end to the Solent. And it's a route I go quite often from Poole into the Solent. And what we've got is, I suppose it just gave a good example of how we could look at a chart and actually maybe start to read and interpret it. So we've got, I suppose, quite obviously, just to the right of centre, we've got an area of shallows there. We can see that it's an area that dries in yellow. So we know that is materially shallower than the darker blue area down to the bottom left. So if we factor in the fact that the prevailing wind in this area is from the southwest, so from the bottom left-hand corner of that chart, the wind will typically come from about the 7 o'clock position up towards the 2 o'clock position. And it's going to go from deep water to shallower water still. And as we've already said, if we've got waves coming into shallower water, then there's a chance they're going to heap up and potentially break. We've also then got the factor of horizontal movement of water through tide. So the tide could be coming out of the Solent or it could be going into the Solent. And we can see here we've got the Needles Channel coming from the sort of 6 o'clock position up towards the 1 o'clock position. But actually also just along the top of the coastline there, we've actually got the North Channel. And that's an area that what you find if you go in that area, then quite often, despite the fact it's quite close to shore, it's actually really quite calm. And that's because the wind has brought the conditions across that shallower water, and that's taken a lot of the energy out of the waves, and those waves and that energy is dissipated in that shallow water. So when you get to slightly deeper water, the other side, it's actually quite, well, relatively speaking, calm. And I suppose my point here is, here we've got a chart. It's an area I know relatively well, but it could be an area you don't know. And you won't be able to necessarily be perfect at your analysis, but a lot of what you see there is predictable. You know, you can think, well, that sandbank, that area of shallow, is going to take a lot of energy out. So the Needles Channel, could that be a more friendly place to go in? But what's the question in terms of wind versus tide? Because I've got tide racing out and wind coming up from the southwest, I could still have a wind against tide condition there as well.
So would you, when we were talking previously about passage planning, and I know that we've done this a lot on expeditions and stuff, would you recommend that, especially when you're going to a new harbour and you don't necessarily understand, when you're looking at a new harbour, you may first obviously look at the facilities that are there and the VHF number and all those type of different things. But really, you need to start to look at more specifics of that coastline and what the weather's going to be doing there, the tide. So it all builds a really good picture of what to expect when you're going those further distances. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, absolutely right, Tom, and factor into that wind as well. You can see, you go down to Portland and Chesil Beach, and the way the wind is sheltered by the Isle of Portland, but flies over the top of the Chesil Bank into the area of Portland Harbour. And that's, again, a predictable feature. So a really great way to try and teach yourself it is in an area that you're very familiar with. So let's imagine that you're, for example, in that case, Portland and the area of Weymouth. Well, it may well be that you're not even afloat, but actually looking at the weather, looking at the tide, and actually predicting what's going to be happening, and then just going standing on the shore and seeing if it is happening. So actually that sets you up better for when you need to do it when you're actually in your boat as well. So that preparation, as you say, is the sign of a good skipper. And then, like we've discussed before, actually making that decision not to go. You know, we had to abort this session earlier in the week because the restream thing wasn't working, and that actually was a good decision. Actually, it wasn't going to work. Let's not push on. Let's stop. And it's just the same for a skipper in a boat.
We've had instances that I think in Ireland on the west coast, there were some horrific storms coming up, and I think you just got ahead of it, and we were in the pack just behind, and we had to abort because there were tremendous winds coming down off the mountains and pummeling the boats to such a degree. I think there was even a container vessel that was, or a big commercial ship that had radioed, that had seen the activity of the two flotillas and had warned, don't go round the next headland because it's absolutely chaos. So you can really need to, like you say, just if the weather is changing or you're not comfortable or it's not safe, then there are, it's far more important to get to a shelter and go boating another day, isn't it, than risk and try and showboat.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing, just picking up on something you said earlier, Tom, you talked about going around the Isle of Portland, and you said the inshore passage, and you've got the 6-10 mile off option as well. And it's about creating sea room. Sometimes getting in close to shore can create calmer conditions, but the problem is, or the price you might pay is if you have a problem, you've got no time to sort it out because you're in a lee shore situation, you've been blown on shore. Whereas getting 8-10 miles off gives plenty enough time for a lifeboat to get there if you actually have that need. And it's a balance, isn't it? There's no absolutes, and we strike those balances. But the be-all and end-all as a skipper has to be, don't take unnecessary risks.
Yeah, in Klaus Torquay, you can either go way off, you can punch yourself through and beat yourself up a little bit, or you want to be as close to Portland that you can almost touch the rocks and you can get up through there at 60-70 knots and have a really fast route to go through. Now, obviously, we're not recommending that for your pleasure boater, but it gives an example of being able to know that local water and know what is navigable and safe to do so. But yeah, with caution, like you say, certainly in a pleasure scenario, things could go wrong when you're that close. So we want to talk also about wind shift, because this creates a different kind of sea, which certainly for somebody that's inexperienced could be potentially quite a dangerous situation. So I'll show the wind shift graph, and then can you talk us through that?
Okay, so the image we're seeing coming up is a very simple concept. And it's, imagine the wind is coming down from the top of the screen downwards. Then the wavefront is going to build up in a pattern coming down the page as per the image. But then the wind could shift round to here, and then the wavefront builds here. Now, waves take a while to dissipate. If the wind's been blowing for a long time, then the sea's built up, and that's quite often why you get some wonderful swell. And that's just the remnants of the wind, but you've still got the swell. So, but just imagine it's waves, and then suddenly you've got waves coming in at different angles, and they interact, and that's just going to create a hugely confused sea. And one of the very sad examples of this was the Fastnet race in '79, where they experienced a wind shift, and the wind was very strong, and then they had that interaction, and that was one of the key reasons that there was so many problems with so many boats, and sadly so many people died. So the question then is, okay, well, what can you do about that? Well, you can look at a weather forecast, can't you? It may well be that the wind direction is going to be from whatever for the period you're out. But what was it doing for the last 24 hours or the last 40? Because if you had a sustained period of wind coming from one direction, and okay, you're going out at 8 o'clock this morning and it's coming from this direction, but what's the effect of that in terms of those two wave fronts interacting? And that's down to preparation and planning again.
with the planning, we've talked previously about looking at an almanac, looking at navionics, which and CMAP both have it, where it gives a great amount of detail on your tide flows and if we're flooding, etc. However, there are a way of measuring these conditions, aren't there, and being able to plan. And when you're looking at your forecasts, shall I show the next slide and you can talk us through when people see what different weather conditions are and how it's measured?
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. It's one of those things as we become more experienced skippers and we're going further afield. We've all heard boat scale, and that's what we've got in front of us. But one of the things that people don't realise is necessarily at the outset is that you've got two elements to it. You've got the wind strength element of the Beaufort scale, and then you've got the sea state element of it as well. So imagine a situation where you have a force 6 wind. So that's a big amount of wind for a small boat. But the question is, what's the sea state? So Poole Harbour is a classic example. We could have force 8 wind from the north, and in the harbour it's flat calm. If we have that wind direction of the southwest, it's not going to be as calm, but because it's not a big area of water and the fetch is less, the waves are, you might get wet and they might be a little uncomfortable, but they're never going to be horrendous. And even in a force 10, 11 or 12 in the harbour, it's, the waves are not especially large. You take that to Port and Bill, different ballgame. So it's just something to start to understand as a skipper, the difference between wind strength and sea state. Sea state is about what you're experiencing in terms of the waves versus the actual wind strength. And actually you'll hear, particularly, I've sort of heard it a lot with military boat drivers who reference sea state all the time, because at the end of the day, that's what they're really interested in, is what are the conditions I'm facing in terms of those waves, not necessarily what the wind strength is. And it just introduces something, there's loads of stuff online. This is from the book again. But you can go out and reference that online. It's just something to start building up in your own mind to differentiate between wind strength and sea state. I think it might be on silent, Tom.
There we go. So I think that would be really useful for people to learn and to become more familiar with how weather affects their boating, but also that they can plan accordingly, because as a new skipper they're not going to want to just land themselves in a force 6. They need to be able to, like we said last week about going further afield, build up that experience. And next week we're going to talk more about the sort of practical application of collating that knowledge. What are some of the things that we're going to cover off on, Paul?
Yeah, and hopefully it sort of comes across now why we actually just wanted to spend half an hour just setting up the next discussion. So we're going to look at how you drive. And my knowledge and understanding of that has come over the years from initially RWA and RNLI sort of training, and then evolved with people known very well to your family, Tom, the likes of Paul Emmer, and actually doing around Britain with Paul jumping on and seeing how he drives a boat, and therefore marrying the ideas of racers with those focused exclusively on sort of rough weather sort of handling. So we're going to look at the issues going up sea or head sea, following seas, beam seas, how we can actually look at making best and safest progress. And again, so it's just sort of expanding on what we've actually looked at and taking the knowledge we have from this session and developing it into how we actually drive the boat.
I think it would be good too also to maybe have a little chat about different hull forms and how they behave. More of a high performance stepped hull is going to have inherently less bow lift, so in a following sea it's something that as an experienced boater you'd drive a little harder to keep the hull working, but as a more inexperienced boater you'd maybe want to tack a little bit and have more of a beam sea, and a deeper V hull or something with maybe a good amount of buoyancy in the nose is going to be far better in a following sea. A narrower boat's going to be better in a head sea. So it'd be good, I think, maybe to talk about that so people can look and evaluate their own style of boat that they've bought, and they can get a bit of a better understanding about the attributes of what they're in as well, probably.
I think it extends to things like engines too, insofar as we've been out, or we did around Britain, in a big diesel Scorpion rib, and it's absolutely fabulous. But if you're in a big diesel rib and you have a turbo, and you don't have a supercharger, there can be quite a lot of turbo lag, and actually getting the revs up to a level where the turbo's working for you, and so you need instantaneous power. That's when sometimes an outboard can actually give you that instantaneous power, whereas a diesel with a turbo, you're winding it up and you're hoping the boat's going to react and nothing happens, or at least it doesn't happen very quickly. So yeah, let's factor those things into it and have a few minutes on that as well.
So thank you everybody for joining today. I'm sorry about the little glitches that are happening with the streaming server. I hope they'll get all sorted. We've made a couple of adjustments on the fly this end, so hopefully you were able to hear Paul and myself to an okay level where you could understand everything that we were talking about and you found it beneficial. As we say, next week we look at then the practical application of what we've learned today, and hopefully this session will enable you to be able to, when you're boating, be able to look ahead and see and understand and read the waves better, so that then we can then show you then next week how to be able to practically handle the boat in those various different conditions. So hope you have a fantastic weekend, and hope you're on the water boating safely. If you haven't already, then there's our free digital subscription to PBR, so jump onto the website there where you can download the latest copy, and it's the subscription for the year, but also it gives you a far more interactive version as well. So there are pop-out videos, and it's a very intuitive way of reading the magazine online. So make sure that you take up the offer of the free digital subscription, and we will be joined again next week by Paul to go through the rest of this rough water handling. We also have a fantastic interview with Gerhard of Gemini Ribs. We're going to be looking at the whole history of Gemini boating in South Africa, in Cape Town where they're based, and we're going to be looking at the future of Gemini, the factory, the history, Zapcats, the whole lot. So that will be a really cool industry insight as well. We also have up and coming interviews with the heads of Yamaha, Honda. We're looking at MDL Marinas as well, chatting to them to see how they've coped in COVID, what they're offering for their berth holders, and how the company has changed since they were formed. So we've got a lot of various cool content coming up. So stay tuned, and we'll see you again next week. Paul, thank you for giving up your Friday evening to educate us on all things waves, and I hope that you have a lovely weekend too.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you everybody, and see you again next week.